Now, it is my pleasure to welcome an esteemed panel to share their insights on AI governance and AI for good from the European perspective. I would like to invite to the stage our esteemed panelists, Mr. Benoit Savaroche, First Counselor, EU Delegation in Singapore, Dr. Gemma Galden-Clavel, CEO and founder Ethicus Tech, and Dr. Andreas Hauser, CEO Digital Service, TÜV SÜD in Singapore. All right. So we'll spend about 40 minutes chatting with the panel, and we'll save the last 15 minutes for audience questions. So you can scan the QR code whenever you see it on the screen and ask questions as we move along through the discussion. All right, so let's get right into this and talk about AI and the European perspectives. So first of all, I just wanted to thank our panelists for joining us on Halloween today. You know, it's kind of an interesting landscape and backdrop to this because as we think about, it's kind of scary. In the last few days, there have been a slew of major announcements from governments all over the world because of this fear of AI, right? A lot of the governments in the world have made announcements on AI in the last 72 hours or so. The UK said they would set up the world's first AI Safety Institute. In the US, President Biden gave an executive order setting new standards on security and privacy protections. In the G7, they initiated a voluntary code of conduct, which they hope will be the bridge until regulations are in place. And in the UN, where just last Thursday, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced the creation of a 39-member advisory body to address issues in the international governance of AI. So Guterres actually said in the statement, quote, "The transformative potential of AI for good is difficult even to grasp. And without entering into a host of doomsday scenarios, it is already clear that the malicious use of AI could undermine trust in institutions, weaken social cohesion, and threaten democracy itself." Now, being from California, perhaps it's natural. Being from California, perhaps it's natural for me to think things in terms of like Hollywood movies. And so hearing that, it sounds like the potential beginnings for a horror movie. But as an optimistic American, I think I would rather see images of cowboys in the American Wild West, right? When thinking about this new world of technology and innovations, I feel like this is the Wild West of our time. So as we look at AI, how the landscape has changed when ChatGPT stormed through the world at the end of last year, made things accessible for the average adolescent here to be able to actually leverage AI. And it wasn't something for just the rocket scientists. All of a sudden, that became a game changer and something that really alerted the researchers and regulators all over the world to think about the potential risks to society. So today, this panel will seek to dive deeper and explore those European perspectives on AI. All right, so we're going to go right into it with Benoit. So with the technology advancing faster than regulators, we've heard from leading American tech founders that they like to move fast, break things, apologize later. And then the people then hope that the EU will come in and swoop in, be the voice of reason, put up the guardrails and save the world. So I guess the EU is almost like the sheriffs in this Wild West, right? So in your work with the EU delegation, how do you answer the question of why is there a need for data regulation?
Yes, I mean, that's interesting what you just mentioned, that a lot is happening very recently, and we feel much less lonely on our approach of regulating AI. I think not long ago, I would have been asked, why is there a need of AI regulation? And we see now that there is more and more convergence on this need, which is very interesting. So I presently work at the delegation of the European Union here in Singapore. Over the last 5 years, I was doing the same job in India. And what's really interesting there is that I attended a lot of public events on AI, the risk, the opportunities. And I could see that almost every time, within the first 15 minutes, the conversation was tweaking to privacy and data protection. Well, at the time, there was no data protection law regulation in India, and there was this feeling which was very important. And another example that I could take is that 2 years ago, WhatsApp conditions for Indian users changed, where Meta decided that the personal data from WhatsApp users could be used by Facebook for targeted advertising. And India realized that this was applying to India, but not to European users, thanks to the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And suddenly it became very palpable for Indian citizens that there was a merit in trying to regulate data. And why and I find your question very interesting. You were talking about data regulation, not AI regulation. Data is one of the three, I would say, three elements, constitutive elements of artificial intelligence. So we have data sets, we have definitely the computing power that is needed to process that, and the algorithm. If not, I mean, talking about the human sector. But data sets is of course a foundational element. And we do feel at the European level that there is a need for regulation, of course, to control the risks. And we are talking about privacy, but it's not only that, it's also to maximize the benefits. And these benefits are seen through the prism of values that we feel and the idea that we have a society and the use of digital technologies for public goods according to ethics. And basically, for the need for data regulation would come from us because we believe that to make the most of AI, you need data. You need data which is available, which is accessible. You need also data which is, I would say, integrable, that can work together between data sets, and reliable. And that brings elements of privacy, we mentioned it, and data protection, but also safety, security, some aspects of interoperability as well, and aspects of ownerships. And if we want to maximize, I mean, the benefit of AI, we need to work around that. And so the EU has not been only active with GDPR or the AI Act, but we've got a lot of regulations that have come to prepare, I mean, this explosion of AI for public good. And I would just mention some of them. I mean, the Open Data Directive, which is for the reuse of public-owned data, for instance, to make it available. We have the Data Governance Act, which is also regulating and maximizing the use of and the sharing of data, which is even proposing a concept of data altruism, where private-owned data will be shared for the public good. So when I was mentioning about, I mean, value-driven regulation, we have the Data Act, which is also ensuring interoperability of data, targeting the fact that data which is stored in clouds would not be blocked by issues of interoperability. We have the Digital Markets Act, which is targeting the gatekeepers, which are stifling competition by retaining data and keeping them, so preventing the use of data by competitors. And of course, I mean, the GDPR that was mentioned. So all these elements are here because we do believe that if we want artificial intelligence to thrive according to our values, we need all these constitutive elements.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and it's also interesting to note that how can maybe regulation be seen as helping innovation in a sense. So maybe I want to go to Gemma for this because you've worked in Europe and now you're in the US, and you're actually a leading voice in tech ethics and algorithmic accountability through algorithm audits. So maybe another sheriff in town in this Wild West. So you heard earlier, we mentioned, and Professor Stepkin mentioned, that the US President Joe Biden released this executive order on these new standards in security and privacy protections for AI, where developers such as Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet's Google, they have to put their AI models through safety tests and submit the results to the US government before their public release. I mean, can you share a bit about what this means to you, and do you think it will truly have an impact?
Sure. These are really amazing developments for someone like me who's been working in the responsible AI space, responsible tech initially, for the last 15 years. Because we've been saying, a lot of people have been saying that the only way to make AI as successful as it can be is by making sure that we address and mitigate its risks. And that there's no future for AI unless we do that. And that as democratic societies, or societies in general, we are very good at that, actually. Societies and democracies are about protecting people. We protect people when we buy a car. We buy cars with seatbelts. Cars don't need seatbelts to function, but we all understand that cars are better because they have seatbelts. During the pandemic, we forced the manufacturers of vaccines to go through clinical trials. And we knew that was going to delay the process, but we knew that in the end, we'd have a safer vaccine. And so the whole world waited for those tests to be performed before the vaccines could be inoculated into the whole population. So basically, this happens for everything around us. The chairs where you are sitting have had to prove that they can hold a human being before being sold. Like everything around us has had to prove that it's not harmful to its users, except for tech, except for AI. So we've seen for a long, long time that there was a profound inefficiency and issue around the regulation of AI. Europe took the lead over 5 years ago with thinking about the AI Act, and now this week, basically everyone has realized that the only way to make the AI future possible is through mitigating its negative impacts. And again, the good news is that this can be done. We've been testing, auditing for the last 7 years, auditing AI systems, inspecting AI systems, showing the world how the problems with AI are not technical problems with technical solutions. They're socio-technical problems with socio-technical solutions. And so the way that we look at AI systems needs to be a bit more complex than what we've been doing until now, that pre-processing and post-processing are as important as in processing when validating a system, like a lot of things that have not been part of the conversations among engineers for the last few years. So I often say that I'm in the business of building the seatbelts of AI, and that's exactly what we need. We need safer AI, just like Volvo developed the seatbelts for cars in Germany a long time ago. So I'm just really, really happy and pleased that this week so many governments have seemed to realize that the idea of move fast and break things is really dangerous, but also doesn't lead us to quality AI. When we audit systems, what we find are systems that malfunction in ways that make them not sellable. We have clients that once they realize the data that we share with them, they decide not to use the AI systems that they spend a lot of money on because they basically don't work. So unless we make them better, I fear that we are playing with the very future of AI. And fairer means auditable, accountable, and subject to a regulation. Now, I do think that the regulation also has to move forward. Europe has been great at establishing the standards, like the principles. What about the practices? And at Etiquette Tech, we want to lead that space. Like the practice, like the regulator wants safety in the car making industry, that becomes a seatbelt. The regulator wants accountable, trustworthy AI. In the real world, that becomes auditable AI, where you can have access to specific metrics that allow you to see whether a system is working well for society and for its own purposes. Yeah. So I think we need to move from those principles to those practices, and that's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's been happening here already, right? Maybe if you can share a bit more, some of the panelists who know about AI Verify in Singapore and its relation to what's happening in the rest of the world. Maybe Benoit, did you want to share a bit about the AI Verify and what you're seeing in that?
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. Singapore has chosen this way of this, I would say, tool, verified tool, which has been developed together with the industry, which would enable the developers to check whether their developed solutions would fit within a number of ethical principles. And what is interesting actually that Singapore has decided not to go to the regulatory path. Saying that, okay, the industry itself can cross-check and check by themselves. But at the same time, we're having a dialogue between Singapore and the European Union, a digital partnership actually, where we are collaborating on a number of digital developments. One of them and the priority is, of course, artificial intelligence. And what is really interesting is the practical and pragmatic approach of Singapore, stating that they do understand that we have a divergence here where we will be, on the hard regulating at the EU, whereas here, that will be left for the industry to cross-check and to check. But at the same time, knowing that, we're living in a global environment and that Europe is a big market, they are very interested in knowing whether the verified toolkit would stand the test of the requirement from the EU. So as Gemma said, the AI Act is not adopted yet, and we still need to work then after on the regulatory, and the implications which are there. And anyway, we cannot do that before the AI Act has been adopted, where we know at least, on the principles. But I do believe that there is a possibility of convergence regarding these values that I mentioned to make this trustworthy, ethical and human-centric AI. The only question then after will be, of course, the enforcement.
Yeah, so I think lots of interesting developments all over the world, in Singapore, obviously, and beyond. Maybe I'll go with Andreas and ask you about the interesting developments that came out of the UK. PM Sunak just said on Thursday that the UK will launch the first in the world AI Safety Institute that will advance the world's knowledge of AI safety and carefully examine, evaluate, and test new types of AI so that we understand what each new model is capable of, exploring all the risks from social harms like bias, misinformation, through most of the extreme risks. So you're a specialist in the business innovation space across various industries like AI quality, smart inspection, digital assurance, to name a few. What are your thoughts on this? And how does AI quality ensure AI systems are safe, reliable, and ethical?
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, it's first of all, it's great that we have such a summit also, and that they announce a safety center. But there's a lot of positioning also happening, right? What we see is not only a hype in technology, a hype in tools, but there's also a hype in kind of regulatory efforts to draw a lot of attentions, right? But it's generally very good. Also to mention that their focus, the summit specifically is focusing on frontier AI, that's cutting edge AI, right? That's very important that we talk about this, but we also need to understand we should talk about things which are now used, right? And not only in 3 to 5 years. But generally this is good. And the more safety institutes are out there, the better it is. But I think there will be a consolidation happening. How does quality, or also what is our approach and how does quality come into the picture? When you look into the landscape of all the tools which we see, like compliance tools, governance tools, as we see an explosion of all kind of testing things. Also the AI Verify, for instance, another tool, right? But how does that now fit into a specific application? That's where we are coming in, that we say, okay, it's good that you have all these different tools and approaches and audits and all this, but for a specific application, what does the organization now need to consider, right? Listening to also our discussion, you have to be an expert to break this down now to what it exactly means. And that's where we are coming with this term quality, because we think you can boil this let's say, the hygiene factors, trustworthiness, transparency, accountability, all these aspects which are critical, you can boil it down to quality, and most important is based on standards. I think, as first of all, the quality term, it just tells you basically to what degree your system meets certain requirements. And if you take your AI system and your application, right, and know what you want to do with it, either you want to scale it in your organization, or you want to put it in a car, or you want to use it for HR in the HR department for CV filtering, when you have that information, you can actually nicely derive what are the quality requirements for these specific applications. As again, when you talk about an AI component in the car, safety is critical, right? If you talk about a bot interacting with someone, also ethical elements are important, also legal elements, right? So we are structuring these, let's say, quality buckets into safety, security, legal, ethics, performance, and sustainability. So every application falls into one or more of these buckets, and behind these buckets, then you can basically break them down into specific quality characteristics, which are coming typically from standards. So, and why we are so much focusing on standards, and I read also some of the questions coming in there, because standards mean there is a consensus in the expert community. And I think this is the critical piece here, because it has been discussed in a transparent manner. One has agreed this is the right approach. At least you can then have some confidence this is the right way to go. What we see right now, there's so many approaches, in-house testing frameworks. They may be very good, but who knows? Nobody has reviewed this. Like a paper, you can write a white paper, it's fine, but it needs to be a peer-reviewed paper, right? So that's our approach. Boil it down to, if you control the quality of AI systems in a specific context, you actually can then also control the risk, and then you basically are able to scale AI, you can demonstrate the ethical use, and also comply with regulations wherever it is. But you mentioned this Wild West very often, right? Because we always said the Wild West comes to an end. That's what we truly believe. Even in the US, the John Wayne is not anymore riding into the horizon also there, right? They have to think of safety terms, yeah.
Very interesting, touche. Yes, the Wild West may not be there anymore, but like it's in different forms, right? And so I think what you said is interesting is we're talking about quality control risk, but how is all of this affecting the AI landscape? I mean, before it was just develop, deploy, speed, 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 and now, you know, you're saying, hey, slow down. How does this affect?
Also, I would not say slow down, but what we see in the last, well, it started with research development. A lot was basically how that stuff works, and you do development work. Then it was more the focus on deployment applications, right? And now we see the shift goes very strong into this risk area, because now the stuff becomes more mature, has a much bigger impact. But what we also heard from you as well is if you don't manage the risk, it will never scale, right? I mean, you may have a few applications here and there, but ultimately it will be not adopted on a larger scale. So we clearly see a lot of shift, a big shift from pure deployment development into this, let's say, compliance, governance, and risk space. I mean, if you just look into the startup community, how many startups come up with actually solutions that help you ensuring the quality or the governance or the compliance, right? That shows already there is a massive shift into this.
All right, well, speaking then of startups who are helping us do this, we'll go over to Gemma then. So, I mean, what is your stance on this? And actually, maybe you can share a bit on your auditing algorithms, and what does it mean, and what are the best practices in implementing it, and how does it affect this conversation?
Sure. Look, one of the things that has shaped the way that I work in the last few years is being in the EU and being European, and seeing how the EU was leading with regulation, but was somewhat failing to promote an alternative industry that was a responsible AI industry. And so what's really interesting is that last year I decided to move my company to the US And pretty much immediately, we got offers that we didn't seek. We got offers for funding, and we're closing a $2 million round on a $20 million valuation, which for an AI responsibility organization is incredible. Like, I still cannot believe it. So it shows how the US, it's also seeing the opportunities in developing, in implementing what Europe has led. And I think that the executive order by President Biden goes along with that. There's a general realization that this is the future and that things need to be done. It's amazing to see, I live in New York, to see how a country that is so reluctant to promote or to support regulation, when it comes to AI, the tide has turned. And with self-regulation, what people are saying, and even people that reject regulation in other spaces, they're like, listen, the industry had 10 years to regulate, to self-regulate. They didn't do it. They missed their chance. And it's just amazing because that goes so much against how US people think about regulation. So it's just fantastic to be there and to see this change of heart. And what prompted me to move to the US is that I'm very lucky that I consult a lot with the European Commission and the Parliament, but all the questions are about, do a taxonomy, help us understand and analyze. And when I would go to the US, the questions were like, so what are the metrics? What are the thresholds? And I'm like, that's the key. That's what we need in order to actually regulate. The industry needs to understand the rules, not just the principle, but what does it mean when I implement it in practice? And so my obsession for the last 7 years doing audits has been, how can we create a practical tool that allows us to translate the concerns of the regulator, the safety standards and the general standards established by the standardization bodies in a space that has something very specific to it. The impacts of AI are always contextual. And so even standards fall short of helping us address those specific impacts in a specific context. And so auditing is like the flexible piece in this whole ecosystem of tools that allows us to see, okay, so we take the standards, we take the regulation, we look at your specific case, and we tell you whether you are in compliance or not. But in AI, standards are not enough. The regulation is not enough. We need audits. Call them what you want. In the US, everyone's calling them audits. In the EU, that's also the word. But basically an inspection mechanism that allows you, in our case, we inspect 15 moments and sources of bias in the algorithmic lifecycle. And one very important thing, what we analyze are outputs at scale. So we don't audit your technical configuration. We don't need to understand the architecture of your system. We need to understand how it impacts society. So we look at your inputs at scale, and then we draw conclusions from those. We look at your outputs at scale, and we draw conclusions based on that. Understanding your input data, understanding your model, but most crucially, understanding your outputs at scale, we can see whether the system is actually having a beneficial or detrimental in terms of being biased, not working well, impact on society. So I think that we have found a way to effectively inspect those systems and provide guarantees to the regulator, but also to society that these systems are working well. And now in this amazing position that we are a startup, so like we're not policymakers, we don't do policy, but we are at the White House regularly because they want those thresholds. They want the results of our audits. In Europe, the DSA, the Digital Services Act, already called last year for audits, and we're really proud that the European Commission is coming to us saying, as soon as you have completed these audits, please come to us and share the results with us, because the secondary legislation of the DSA, we want to base it on the actual practice that you develop together with the industry. So I think that this virtuous circle of policymakers, startups, and actors in the responsible AI space, and an industry that is willing to comply, that's what's going to create the new practices that will make sure that whenever an AI piece of product comes to our hands, we are protected as citizens, as we are protected whenever a piece of food, a piece of medicine, or a chair falls into our hands. So it's not about being more strict with tech because we're afraid of it. It's only asking tech to do the same thing that we ask from any other manufacturer in the world. Make sure that you implement the precautionary principle. Make sure that you can provide guarantees that you will not harm people with your innovation and developments.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting example, because I just heard last year from the Assistant Cybersecurity of the Agency of Singapore. He was talking about water. He was comparing cybersecurity to water regulation. And he's like, we can say whatever, let the private sector decide if we have safe water. But then how does that affect us, right? How does that affect public health, efficiencies? And so I thought that was an interesting analogy. And then, so I guess I would then go to Benoit. You deal with regulation, and you were talking about being the sheriff before. I mean, will this regulation stifle innovation? What is your stance on that?
Well, that's something that we hear regularly, and that's, I think it's an antenna. But again, I mean, we've heard that now you see it, I mean, moving away. And what Gemma was mentioning is that actually it's generating innovation. It's generating innovation, a new way how to understand better artificial intelligence. When we were talking about explainability, for instance, I do remember, I mean, a few years ago we said, no, but AI, I mean, that will be a black box and nobody will be able to explain, and we have to leave it as it is. That's not true. I mean, the fact that actually regulation is giving some ways on where we want to go, it helps in developing a sense of certainty and predictability. And actually that develop a whole ecosystem of innovation trying to find ways to comply with this. Of course, we can say that there are some innovations that will be even banned through the AI Act, depending on, I mean, do we want to manipulate children? Do we want to exploit them? No, we don't. So we are not going to develop innovation in that sense. But again, giving this sense on where we want to go, I mean, is in our view, on the contrary, is creating an environment that helps developing innovation, and definitely innovating tools helping the understanding and how AI works.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this is super interesting, and I have a million more questions, but I actually want to get to the audience questions, and I just had to laugh because I just read the last question, and I want to pose it to the panel. So from the audience, if regulating AI is too hard of a problem for us, can maybe AI help us to solve it? Good question.
It looks like everything you plug in ChatGPT and gives you the answer. I mean, first of all, I think regulating AI is not too hard. That we make it very complex. It is, of course, there are things, when I hear the discussion, a lot of aspects one has to consider, but you can break that really down into very specific criteria you have to fulfill. Also, and you do audits already for years. Companies, they're doing nothing else than evaluating, inspecting systems. They know exactly how that works. So I think it's also where I see the gap is this awareness that how that works, translating this complexity of regulations. And we talk about EU, we talk about China, US, and so on. Just wondering when the next president comes into office in the US, whether there's a different executive order coming in, and that changes maybe again. But this makes things very complex. But I think it's also up to the stakeholders of the different parts, regulators, the industry, and also others, to explain what that really means in terms of practical applications. And then, of course, first of all, it breaks down the problem, and it is manageable, obviously. And when you read the AI Act, it's also not rocket science. You just have to read through it and spend some time on it. That, of course, we will also, as we as someone who is auditing and certifying and testing, of course we will use AI as well, because it's another way of doing things easier and faster, right? But I think for, you don't use AI because you don't understand the problem. That's, I think, not the way to go, right? First you have to understand the problem, and then you apply AI in a certain way, so that you still have, as we say, the human oversight, right? Also blindly throwing the AI at the AI regulation, I think that's not a good idea.
If you allow me the political incorrectness, AI is like a mediocre white man. It has opinions on everything. That doesn't mean they're good. I think it's very important to understand AI for what it is. Natural language processing just processes pre-existing text and gives and reproduces patterns through zillions of micro grammar-related algorithms. That's what it does. So the answers that we'll get when using ChatGPT will always represent that. So ChatGPT will always be really bad at innovating. The secret of AI and what makes it so powerful is past data. The things that we already know that have happened in the past and that have been mainstream. So all the outliers are sacrificed in any AI process. And so if you ask AI a hard question, you'll get the worst responses. AI will always be better at the things that a lot of people have responded in the past, like what is the capital of France? It's Paris. That's, you'll never find any issues. But the more complex that you make the question, the worse AI will be, because at the end of the day, it's just algorithms that process grammar. And that's what it is. So please stop glorifying AI. Stop hallucinating around AI. For those of us who work every day on algorithms, most of the AI around us are glorified Excel sheets. So once we understand and we get real about what the beast is, I think we'll get better at regulating it, at innovating around it, and at making it better than it currently is. If we keep falling for this glorification and mythification of AI, I think we're doing a disservice to the science of AI.
Did you want to add anything? Yes, it's what is it, the inmates running the prison? Is that what we're gonna let happen if we let AI decide its own fate? All right, let's go to the next question. Data, I guess AI, indeed business in general, have a global scope. Who has the authority to regulate this global scope and enforce the rules? Is that the EU? I don't know.
Well, if the rest of the world agrees, I'm sure that the EU will be happy to take it. No, definitely, I mean, what we pride ourselves is, yes, to set the trend. It's been said for AI, we started 5 years ago to think we were very lonely at the time, and we feel that we're gathering momentum. But of course, it has to be inclusive. Inclusive also, I mean, from the whole world, and we know that there are different sensitivities and that there are also variation in values. But we need to work in trying to find convergence, and there has been a lot of initiatives, I would say, multilateral initiatives. Of course, I mean, you mentioned the G7, for instance. There is this global partnership on AI, which also gathered a number of like-minded countries. But the UN, and you mentioned the UN has been working. I think what is quite comforting is that we saw that, and it has had some results already. You may remember a couple of years ago, UNESCO published this guiding principle on ethical AI, and that was validated by all the members of UNESCO. So ITU is working on AI for goods as well. So there is, I think, and I think we all understand that there is a need, because of its global nature, to find as much as possible convergence in this approach and regulation. I mean, how far can we go? I mean, future will tell, and we'll see if we can manage to take on board the different sensitivities, but definitely there is, I think, a shared feeling of a need of getting into a global approach.
Yeah, well, I agree. If everybody thinks Europe should do the global regulation, then it would be awesome. But that's, as you say, definitely not happening. I think on a global level, UN, you can probably agree on certain principles, but I don't think you can get to the level where you really enforce globally. I think this is a bit too far, because ultimately these 3 different markets, what we see, which shape basically regulation, this is China, Europe, and the US, there are differences, let's face it, and I think on that level you can enforce, right? You can enforce on a country level, because you simply have still differences, cultural differences. I think you can agree globally on ethical principles, but the actual breaking it down into enforceable requirements, I think this works then only ultimately on the country or on the region.
Okay, next one. How do you see the need for proper digital identity infrastructure, i.e. a decentralized one with the expanded use of AI? Who would like to tackle that?
Yeah, I would just, I would say yes, great idea, right? It's another piece of an overall picture, right? That's like another tool, another element, and we have to see always the whole picture. You need to look into infrastructure, into specific processes, into organizations, and that makes it, of course, a bit complex, right? That you cannot just apply a few tools or set up a nice infrastructure, that's it, but that could be also part of an overall solution, yes.
Just on this, we were very fortunate that the European Agency for Fundamental Rights asked us to audit the Smart Borders initiative in Europe, so basically all the digital identity linked to borders in the EU. And I gotta say, the challenge of digital identity is not AI. It's database harmonization and sharing of data. But AI is relevant for facial recognition, but as an application. But the problem we have with digital identities is that the data that needs to be shared to ensure that someone has a robust digital identity right now does not exist in similar formats. Some countries are not willing to share that data. So yeah, I oftentimes the most challenging issues in the tech space are about boring tech. I'm a big fan of boring tech. The world runs on boring tech. And because we keep talking about AI, we're not investing in boring tech. When the pandemic started, the US had a huge problem with updating and counting the dead and all of that because all their systems were programmed in COBOL, which is a programming language that no one knows about anymore, so they had to go back and rehire all the retired engineers who knew how to program in COBOL to update all their systems. That is unacceptable, that we have all our infrastructure, digital infrastructure of the public sector running on a code that no one knows how to work on anymore. These are the real problems that we find when we are looking and auditing technology. Boring tech is the main issue that we have right now. And I think that the issues with boring tech are way greater than any issue with AI at the moment, I dare say.
And maybe if I could say also regarding the digital identity, I mean, that's a topic that we're discussing also with Singapore in the digital partnership, where we're working on paperless trade, on electronic signature, and therefore on interoperability. I would agree that on digital identities, there is an issue of sharing data, but there is also an approach, for instance, for the EU. I mean, we are very keen on data minimization, that you are not going to share more data that is needed, and that's something that may not be shared all across the world. So talking about something which will be, I mean, available for the whole world would be a bit too far. But again, definitely we need to find ways that we can have interoperability for this type of users. But again, I mean, we're getting maybe out of AI.
Okay, let's go to the last question then before we end this session. I think we're at one of those rare inflection moments in history where we can sense that everything is going to be different going forward. So this is my question. What is a positive outcome that you're looking forward to in this new AI world? Let's end on a positive note, not the horror movie.
Okay, so do you want? If I can start for me, I mean, and getting away from regulation and from all the risk and whatever. For me, I mean, the most positive outcome is that AI is definitely an accelerator for research. And I do believe that, I mean, we saw that with AlphaFold, for instance, and the work on prediction of protein folding and all that. And I do believe that there is one element on which it could help, which would solve one of the biggest crises that we're facing on climate change, which is how to solve this and find new ways of producing energy, and very particularly on fusion energy. And I do hope that AI will help us mastering this type of energy that will help in decarbonization, of course, and on climate change. if we find it with the help of AI, will we be able then after to use it for the greater good of humanity? That's another question.
Yeah, I also think we should first see where we're coming from, why we are using AI, right? Not only for making organizations more efficient and more profitable, right? I think the goal should be really to tackle the big problems, what you mentioned, climate change and others, also inclusivity, access to knowledge, for instance, right? I mean, imagine all these other countries who are not actually in the top developed countries. They are very behind. They have massive problems. We have, for instance, we start probably a collaboration in Senegal about AI, using AI in the healthcare space, because then you can do remote analysis, remote care, and things like that. And I think the focus should really on tackling these big problems, and that then justifies a lot of effort to make sure that also that stuff works, right? And yes, we still use that for becoming more agile and more efficient, but I think the promise here is really to tackle the big problems. Because honestly, when we continue like we do, CO2 emission goes up, we continue destroying the planet, right? The inclusivity is not getting better, so I think the technology could help really tackle those fundamental issues, yeah.
There was a session today where the panelists were asked, what do you think is the biggest risk of AI? And for me, the biggest risk is that AI continues to reinforce the power of the powerful. For me, one of the biggest challenges that we have as modern societies is inequality and the big differences between the opportunities and the life chances of the haves and the have-nots. And in my experience, technology until now, and also AI, reinforces the power of the powerful. The good news is that AI has the seed to change that interaction. What I love and what makes me passionate about AI is that I can quantify how AI works and operates. I can have data and metrics on how society is working and how our decisions are being automated. And so for me, AI is a way to making visible dynamics of discrimination and dispossession that have been invisible for a long, long time. I think that AI brings with it an era of new transparency on everything. Decisions that up until very recently were made by a group of people in a closed room now become code. And code I can audit. I cannot audit a group of people in a room. I can audit code. And so once all our decisions are turned into code, the code is open for the scrutiny of the whole world. So I think that there's a fundamental promise of a better society and a better world in AI, but we need to make it happen. If we insist on black box AI, if we insist on opaque, non-trustworthy AI, if we insist on irresponsible AI, that will not happen, and technology will just reinforce the power of the powerful and make our societies more unequal. But if we get this right, I think that there's a new era for all of us where transparency and equality are on the agenda and on the plate.
Right, well, thank you so much for that. A very hopeful ending to this. I just wanted to kind of wrap it up. What did we hear today? If you don't manage the risk, you will never scale. No future for AI unless we mitigate the damages. And finally, the Wild West is dead. But hopefully we will have our Hollywood happy ending. All right, well, thank you again to our keynote speaker, Professor Stepkin, our esteemed panelists here, Benoit, Gemma, and Andreas, for sharing your insights. Thank you to Switch, AIMX, and Enterprise Singapore for organizing this conference. Thank you to the audience for listening and for your questions. And please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn to continue the conversation, and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator, and fellow panelists. Please come forward for a photo-taking session. With this, we've come to the end of day one of AIMX Summit 2023. We hope everyone have gained many key takeaways from the AI sharing and discussions. Quick announcement, do note that tomorrow's AIMX will be held at Level 4 Roselle Simpo Room Level 4. All right? Thank you, and have a great evening ahead.